The Clitheran High Council had made their judgment absolute. Captain Arlen Voss would rot in the Deepstone Vault, a prison carved into the heart of an asteroid where no light reached and no rescue could come. The crime? Defending 3 Clitheran cubs from their own military tribunal, cubs deemed defective for showing what the elders called weakness. In human terms, it was called compassion. The council had expected compliance. They had not expected defiance from an alien species barely a century into the galactic community. But Captain Voss had stood before their 9 crystalline thrones and spoken words that would echo through Clitheran history. If protecting children is a crime in your civilization, then I'll wear that crime proudly. They threw her into the deepest cell. 300 meters of solid rock separated her from the surface. No doors, no windows, just a narrow shaft through which they lowered her, then sealed with molecular bonding that could withstand starship weapons. The Clitherans, a species that had evolved from predatory pack hunters, believed in permanent solutions. What they hadn't accounted for was that the cubs remembered. Terran pressed his 6-clawed hand against the stone, feeling the vibrations. At 14 solar cycles, he was the eldest of the 3 cubs Captain Voss had saved. His siblings, Mira and Keth, watched him with the bioluminescent patterns on their scales flickering nervously in the darkness. "The elders will execute us if they discover this," Mira whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind that swept across the asteroid's surface. "The human didn't abandon us," Terran replied, his voice carrying the gravelly undertone of emerging maturity. "We don't abandon her." 3 months had passed since the imprisonment. 3 months of planning, stealing mining equipment and learning everything they could about the Deepstone Vault's construction. The elders had built it to be impenetrable from the outside. They had never considered anyone would be foolish enough to try digging through solid rock. They had never met humans. They didn't understand what humans taught those who knew them. Terran activated the plasma torch, a piece of construction equipment he'd borrowed from a maintenance depot. The blue flame kissed the stone and molecules began to separate. Behind him, Keth operated the matter displacer, carefully removing the liquefied rock and depositing it in a growing pile 30 meters away. "How long will this take?" Keth asked, his young voice trembling. "As long as it takes," Terran answered. "She waited for us when the tribunal wanted to execute us for contamination by lesser emotions. She faced the council alone. We can dig through stone." Captain Arlen Voss had stopped counting days. In the absolute darkness of her cell, time became meaningless. She rationed the nutrient paste they dropped through the shaft once every 20 hours. She exercised to maintain muscle mass, ran through every survival scenario she'd trained for and tried not to think about Earth. Tried not to think about how she'd never see the sun again. The Clitherans had been clear. She would spend the remainder of her natural life in this hole. 40, maybe 50 years if she was unlucky enough to maintain her health. No trial, no appeal. In their society, the council's word was biological law, encoded into their very instincts through millions of years of pack evolution. But humans hadn't evolved that way. Humans questioned. Humans rebelled. Humans protected their young, even young that weren't their own species. That's what had gotten her into this mess. She was running through her daily calisthenics when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong in the silence. A faint rhythmic scraping. She froze, listening. There it was again, deliberate, persistent. For the first time in 3 months, Captain Arlen Voss smiled in the darkness. The digging took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of Taran, Mira, and Keth working in rotating shifts, carefully excavating a tunnel that angled down through 300 meters of asteroid rock. They worked at night when the surface patrols were minimal. They hid their equipment in abandoned mining shafts. They covered their tracks with the precision of creatures whose ancestors had been ambush predators. The elders never suspected the cubs. Why would they? In Clitheran society, once the pack hierarchy rendered judgment, it was accepted without question. Defiance was bred out of them millennia ago. But these 3 cubs had been exposed to something dangerous: human influence. Captain Voss had told them stories during the 3 days she'd sheltered them. Stories of human history. Of slaves who freed themselves, of children who stood against tyrants, of ordinary people who refused to accept injustice simply because authority declared it so. "Humans have a saying," she told them as they huddled in her ship while the tribunal hunted them. "Where there's a will, there's a way. It means that determination can overcome almost any obstacle." Taran remembered those words as his claws scraped through the final centimeter of rock. The wall of Captain Voss's cell crumbled inward, and 3 sets of bioluminescent scales illuminated the darkness with soft blue light. Captain Arlen Voss stood blinking at the impossible sight before her. 3 young Clithrons covered in rock dust, their scales dimmed from exhaustion, staring at her with eyes that reflected their own light. Taran? Her voice cracked from disuse. The eldest cub stepped forward and extended his hand, a gesture she'd taught him distinctly human. "You said humans don't leave their pack behind," he said simply. "You're part of our pack now. We don't leave you behind either." Mira and Keth moved to her side, supporting her weakened frame. Behind them, the tunnel stretched upward, a testament to 6 weeks of relentless determination. "They'll hunt all of us now," Captain Voss warned. Though she was already moving toward the tunnel, her soldier's instincts overriding her amazement. "Let them try," Taran replied, and in his voice she heard something that made her heart swell with pride. Defiance. "You taught us that some things are worth fighting for. That justice matters more than law. That compassion isn't weakness." They climbed through 300 meters of hand-dug tunnel, 4 figures moving through stone that should have been their tomb. By the time they reached the surface, a stolen transport ship waited. Keth had apparently learned more about human resourcefulness than Captain Voss had realized. As they lifted off from the asteroid, alarms finally began to wail below them. But they were already gone, jumping to hyperspace. 4 refugees bound for human space where, Voss had promised them, asking questions wasn't a crime. The Clithron High Council would later debate what had gone wrong. How had their perfect system failed? How had 3 cubs accomplished what should have been impossible? They never understood the answer. They'd imprisoned a human, but humans have always been exceptional at one thing: teaching others to be free. And cubs, it turned out, were very good students.